All right. Do you guys got a notification?
It says Youri is recording the call.
Okay, perfect. All right. Well, okay. Well, welcome everyone to another episode of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. And I am very happy because once again, it's all things Canada edition, and we welcome back to our show one of my favorite peoples and good friend of the show, Yves Engler, Canadian historian and geocritic, media critic, and journalist. And we are joined also by Bianca Mugyenyi. I hope I didn't butcher your last name, Bianca.
You almost got it. It's Mugyenyi.
Mugyenyi. Okay, perfect. I'm gonna work on that. Who also is in environmental justice campaigner, also an NGO critic, also an anti-imperialist, and of course, and it's the first time we have a husband and wife team, so I'm very happy about that. And then just before we get started, you both, Yves, I know you're the author of several books, which I do have: The Ugly Canadian, Stephen Harper's Foreign Policy, The Black Book of Canadian Foreign Policy, House of Mirrors, Justin Trudeau's Foreign Policy. But you and Bianca are the co-authors of this book, Stop Signs: Cars and Capitalism on the Road to Economic, Social, and Ecological Decay, which is all about cars. Maybe we'll get the chance to talk into it, but we're going to first talk about this extraordinary campaign. So first of all, welcome to the both of you to One Plus One.
Thank you, Youri. Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
My pleasure. And okay, let's now before we get into this fantastic campaign that you both are leading, which is trying to get Canada not to have a seat at the UN Security Council. And just very briefly, what was the pair of you's reaction to Justin Trudeau's sort of anti-American Canadian mythology speech about how everything is all hunky dory with Black Canadians in Canada, and things are better under him than Stephen Harper, and of course that sort of leads into the campaign you guys are doing, because Trudeau, of course, is pursuing aggressive social and environmental apartheid at home in Canada towards its Indigenous people, and of course an anti-Black and anti-Indigenous foreign policy in Haiti, Venezuela, Brazil, Colombia, Bolivia, and much of Africa.
Well, I think Youri, you've answered the question. I felt pretty similar to what you've just expressed. Justin Trudeau is really the master of rhetoric and a really friendly face, but that doesn't match his actions, particularly when it comes to foreign policy, a thing that very few people living in Canada I think are fully aware of what is being done in their name, often to Black and Brown people on the African continent, from climate to mining to Indigenous rights here in Canada. I think there's a lot more talk than action when it comes to the sort of the anti-racist work of the Canadian government.
Yves, your reaction to Trudeau's everything's all Black Canadians, we hear your anger and we're protecting you, and his the usual sort of Canadian politician thing, which is we're the better version of the United States and everything is all fine in Canada, as opposed to the United States, of course.
Well, Justin Trudeau, of course, took a knee at that anti-racism demonstration on Parliament Hill, I guess about a week ago now, which, Justin Trudeau is very good on symbolism. Justin Trudeau also participated in the biggest ever climate march in Canadian history in Montreal. That's, I guess, last September.
Even while he's pursuing, environment, even while he's pursuing pipelines all over the place
himself. It's so strange. There's people who say no one has ever protested themselves as much as Justin Trudeau.
Yeah, exactly. So it was not long after he purchased, or the government purchased the
pipeline,
the tar sands pipeline, right? So you have to, at one level, kind of admire the willingness to be just so crass in doing something symbolically and then doing something else in terms of substance and actual policy. So that's just more of the same. There are many different examples of if you take, on one hand, it's all about a feminist foreign policy. On the other hand, it's about a key foreign policy thing going on is selling $15 billion in weaponry to probably the most misogynistic regime in the world in Saudi Arabia. So there's many examples you can point to of sort of saying one thing and then doing another thing. It's at this point, it shouldn't come at all as a surprise to anyone. Obviously, all politicians do that to some extent. I think Justin Trudeau is on the kind of outlier of a sort of liberal branding kind of politician, and then continuing inegalitarian policies, imperialistic policies, etc.
And then before we get expanding on that and getting into the campaign and Bianca, your wonderful article that you wrote for Ricochet, is Canada still doing its version of stop and frisk towards its mainly black population?
No. I mean, well, carding has been challenged, most importantly in Ontario. I'm not sure about every provincial legislation on that. So there's been
a lot of pushback against the carding, and I think some pretty major victories.
Okay,
but as you may have seen, just in the last couple of days, there's been, well, first of all, two Indigenous people have been killed at the hands of police in New Brunswick, which is obviously a very small province. So two people in over, I think, a 3-week or so period is quite extreme. And then also there was the imagery from Alberta of an Indigenous leader who just got viciously assaulted by the police. This is actually from a couple months ago, and the video just came out. The dash cam came out, I guess yesterday, maybe the day before, and the dash cam shows really clearly just basically a totally insane assault by the one police officer. The assault was so aggressive against the Indigenous chief that the police officer, the white police officer, also effectively assaulted his partner in his zealousness to attack.
Sure, we definitely have, and this is another place where it's really important to not just look outwards, is we have our own issues and problems with police violence, and anti-blackness and anti-indigeneity as well within the police forces in Canada, that we're having to reckon with. It is an international problem, and it certainly is a Canadian problem as well.
Yeah, exactly, and which is why when friends of mine got in touch with me and they wanted to know my impression on the mass protests that are happening in the U.S., but also the kind of solidarity protests that was happening in yours truly, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, France, and so forth. I said to them, look, I think it's great to see solidarity protests and mass uprisings and the pushback against police brutality and white supremacy in the United States. But this is not just an American issue, because there's an epidemic of police.
Exactly. And when we go to these
custody in Australia and elsewhere.
I see that people are honoring George Floyd, but are also using it as an opportunity to talk about all of the Black people that have been killed in Canada at the hand of the police.
Exactly.
There's sort of there's some interesting political dynamics with regards to like Black Lives Matter in Canada, and so the Canadian media, particularly the CBC, is pretty comfortable with portraying police brutality in the U.S. and anti-blackness in the U.S. in a pretty, they're not denying it. They portray the protests in a fairly positive light. So they will.
While depicting them, while of course depicting Canada.
They get very all of a sudden when it comes to Toronto police, all of a sudden they will get much more cautious in how they sort of portray what's going on and protest against that. But I think that certainly in the past few weeks, BLM Toronto and I guess Canada more generally has done a pretty good job of using. There's some degree of like opening that takes place with on this issue with regard to the U.S. and the Canadian media, and then using that opening to make sure to bring it back home and point out that in Toronto, Black people with 20 times higher death at hands of the police than white people, and things like that. So it's an interesting kind of like political dance that is played based upon sort of an international thing or particularly U.S. thing in this case, and then bring it home. But my impression is that's happened in lots of places around the world. Like clearly what they've done in Britain in terms of ripping down the statue of the slave trader there. That was also sort of using a American political thing that opens up some space in the media and whatever, and then bringing it home and stuff like that. So. It seems like a lot of the movements have done pretty good on that, capitalizing on that dynamic.
Let's hope it continues to go that way, and not just all these protests. I was asking Margaret Kimberly of Black Agenda Report if she's worried if the protest was just Trump derangement syndrome, and then part of me is worried that's that the protests in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, France, where there's a lot of anti-Black racism, but more. I mean, in terms of the Five Eyes Alliance, it's more of anti-Indigenous racism as well as an anti-Black, racism with deaths in the custody. Let's hope that's not just an anti-American protest, but as you were mentioning, Yves, people trying to use the protest as highlighting, hey, things are not all hunky-dory in Britain, in Australia, in and of course yours truly, Canada. All right, so let's talk about the campaign that you're both involved in, and Yves, and congratulations to the both of you, because Yves, this was always your dream to sort of get the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute off the ground so that it can be sort of a leading voice in anti-imperialism and highlighting Canada's real role in the world. So. So let's talk about it, and but Bianca, let's first go to you because you wrote an article for Ricochet Media called 10 Reasons Canada Should Be Rejected from Having a Seat at the UN Security Council. And can you give, you don't have to give, of course, you don't have to give all of the 10 reasons, but can you give 5 reasons why Canada should be rejected?
Yeah.
And of course, Yves, you can chime in anytime.
Just to preface all of this, so we're, this is the first campaign of the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute. We're working with other activists on this, and we are using this opportunity when all eyes are on Canada and Canada's foreign policy to actually talk about what Canada is actually doing in our name. And when, you take a close look, we see that, the Canada abroad is really not the force for peace and human rights that we think it is, and that I think most people living in Canada would desire it to be. And so basically the campaign is saying that Canada does not merit a seat on the United Nations Security Council. This is a body that has quite a bit of power. It's the highest decision-making body of the United Nations. And we, due to our poor foreign policy record, which I'll get into in a bit, that echoes Washington, that's really sort of quite sycophantic, and that also is, really tied up and aligned with corporate interests, that this is undeserving of a place on the United Nations Security Council. And so some of the areas that we highlight are, I've done a lot of climate justice work, and one of the places that Canada is really not a leader is climate, right, on the international stage, right? Our greenhouse gas emissions are supposed to be going down. We've already fallen through when it comes to the Paris 2015 commitments that it made in 2018 are our greenhouse gas emissions actually went up by 15 million tons, right? And when you compare our greenhouse gas emissions to that of, say, countries in Africa, it's like 50 times in some cases greater. And we know that the people who are suffering the most under climate change, climate disruption, climate catastrophe are those who are actually emitting the least amount, right? It's a death sentence, climate change, for so many people around the world on the African continent. So this is one of the areas that we're highlighting is Canada's greenhouse gas emissions, the fact that we bought a pipeline, in fact, in 2018. This is the kind of policies that we have, right? But yet project this image of ourselves as a climate leader to the world. And that's what we need more than ever right now. Another issue is mining. Canadian mining is responsible for unbelievable amounts of devastation across the globe. Canada's a global mining giant. Again, as someone who was born in Africa, I think a lot about the mining that happens in places like Tanzania, Senegal, Congo. Canada has been called to task by the United Nations and is not taking the necessary steps. So that's another example of Canada sort of falling short. Canada, in terms of Palestine, when we talk about human rights and peace, has isolated itself on the world stage when it comes to Palestine. Our voting record is abysmal when it comes to voting around Palestinian rights, voting against resolution after resolution after resolution that upholds Palestinian rights. So this is a really stark and dire example of Canada really having a terrible foreign policy record. And then there are other things, when it comes to things like nuclear bans, when it comes to things like protocols around torture. Canada, again, has not been a leader, has not voted the way that it should. And another big, example would be just the treatment of Indigenous peoples in Canada, right? In terms of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which is very important. We've been seeing, before the sort of the COVID pandemic exploded, one of the biggest things that was happening in Canada was the Indigenous movements that were, protesting these pipelines that are being built through their land, and gas fracking through Indigenous land, and being met with tremendous violence, from Trudeau. So a lot is left to be desired when it comes to our treatment of Indigenous people here in Canada.
Exactly, perfect. And Yves, anything you want to add to that? Some of the reasons why Canada should be rejected from having a seat at the Security Council.
I mean, there's a long list. People can take a look at the petition on the foreignpolicy.ca website, foreignpolicy.ca/petition. That gives some reasons there, and the article you mentioned that Bianca wrote that contrasts with Canada's competing with Ireland and Norway for two seats to represent the Western Europe and Others group. And so if you compare Canadian policy toward Ireland and Norway, and this is not an endorsement of Ireland and Norway's foreign policies, but it's very clear that Canadian policy is consistently more anti-Palestinian than Ireland and Norway. Canada emits way more greenhouse gas emissions per capita than Ireland and Norway. Canada is aggressively involved in this campaign to remove Venezuela's UN-recognized government. The claims on that campaign is that we're trying to uphold democracy and human rights in Venezuela, but we're in our campaign to remove Venezuela's government, we're aligned with a government in Colombia that is responsible for far greater human rights violations. We're aligned with the government in Honduras that has much weaker constitutional legitimacy than the Nicolas Maduro government. So there's many aspects. Venezuela is another important part, and it should be mentioned. This goes against UN Charter, right? The interference, naked interference in Venezuela's affairs, with literally recognizing a marginal opposition politician, Juan Guaido, as the legitimate president of the country. If that is not a form of that doesn't contravene the UN charters on interference in other countries' affairs. I don't know what would. Well, I guess maybe a full-scale invasion would be the only other thing. The sanctions that Canada's adopted against Venezuela, again, that's contrary. It's only supposed to be the United Nations Security Council that has the capacity to adopt sanctions. So. There are many different reasons. They're listed in the open letter that was signed by a very large number of prominent people, but now has actually been signed. And Bianca's coordinating, leading this thing. It's been signed by more than 3,000 people, more than 30 organizations. It's been submitted to all the UN ambassadors in New York, the different countries' permanent missions at the UN, and it's actually having effect. It was published in the Toronto Star, the biggest circulating newspaper. It was initially launched in the Toronto Star. They published it. They published it in this form that was quite interesting. Is that it's the Toronto Star's the most liberal newspaper. It actually has a supposed kind of social justice mandate to it. In practice, that's obviously more complicated, but they published it as a debate. So they weren't really it's a very strong text. They weren't prepared to just publish it straight up. They needed to have a yes versus no. So we were the no side of no, Canada doesn't.
We're the no campaign.
We're the no, Canada doesn't seat on the UN Security Council, and then they had a really just a kind of embarrassing right wing piece. It's like a perfect example of how. If you're right wing and you don't have really anything to say, you can get 700 words in a major newspaper. If you're left wing and you craft a very well crafted, very substantive article, maybe you can have a chance of getting in. But if you're right wing, you can get in with just quite frankly a waste of 700 words. The campaign's been, the Prime Minister's been forced to respond. The Foreign Affairs Minister a couple of days ago was forced to respond to this campaign, not only targeting UN ambassadors. We sent a petition signed by, like I said, more than 3,000 people. So it is actually having quite an effect on a very modest but important discussion around Canadian foreign policy.
That's fantastic. And now going back to, all right, I'll try to push back a little bit on Canada versus Norway and Ireland. Now, I unfortunately don't know much about Irish history. Certainly don't know much about Irish history after they freed themselves of the British and their foreign policy. So I'm going to leave Ireland aside, but I know a little bit about Norway, which is a member of NATO, just as Canada is. So that means that Norway has played a part in the destruction of Yugoslavia, which you have written about, when you give lectures on, Canadian history. That also means that Norway played a part in destroying Libya in that war for oil. I'm not now, Yves. You could probably answer this, but did Norway support the ouster of Aristide when the Paul Martin and the Bush government, did that imperial project?
Well, no. I mean, I don't remember if they made a diplomatic comment in favor of the coup. They certainly weren't involved in the coup. There's no.
Okay.
I don't believe I ever came across much about Norwegian troops as part of the UN mission in Haiti or any of that. I'm not. Norway is clearly a part of NATO. That's for sure. And if you look at some of the stuff that we've, that one of the things we put out there was in the petition, we talked about how Canada didn't. We talked about how Canada.
The Canadian deep state has just sent a flight to kind of ruin our interview.
You landed on the camera.
Anyways, Yves, as you were saying. So
Norway. Canada didn't. One of the things in the petition is that Canada isn't participating in this 122 country nuclear disarmament bid for a nuclear ban, nuclear weapons ban, and Norway didn't. Ireland did participate in this. Norway didn't, and I didn't. I think in large part because none of the NATO countries, NATO of course is a nuclear weapons club, and Canada's involved in the planning around nuclear weapons that NATO does. So Norway didn't participate. I'm not sure if Norway did participate in the 2011 bombing of Libya. I don't. But my understanding of that is that not every NATO country actually participated. That NATO took it on. But my understanding was maybe even like I have to check this. Maybe like Germany. I'm not even sure that Germany participated, even though Germany is obviously a major NATO player. But my recollection is a number of the NATO countries didn't participate. Nonetheless, in the case of Libya in 2011, it was a Canadian general that led the whole thing, right? It's not just like a matter of there is NATO is an alliance that there then becomes a question of how much contribution you provide to that alliance. Canada has always been at the center of the NATO alliance, right? Norway has been a member, but much more at the periphery. It was Canada, the U.S., and Britain that set up NATO, right? France is part of NATO, but France has been, at one point was out of NATO for 20 years. I forget exactly how long. But so there's differing degrees to which the contribution. So I completely agree with you. This is not in any way an endorsement of Norway's foreign policy, but I have to say for myself, as somebody who's obviously followed Canadian foreign policy very closely, I've been a bit surprised at how obviously worse Canadian foreign policy is than when you start taking a look at Ireland and Norway. I presumed that it would be more, and I haven't investigated this in really in depth than Norway and Ireland, but I would presume that the contrast wouldn't be as stark. But there are just many examples where it's easy to find where the contrast is stark, where Canada is just so much obviously worse than Norway and Ireland.
But it's true. I mean, none of these countries are perfect by any means. And as Yves started out by saying, it's not an endorsement of either of these, but it's really just about trying to reduce the amount of harm, in some ways. And like it's just looking at their international track records and having to choose, it's a vote. And I think on the balance, we don't want to reward the particularly bad behavior of the Canadian government.
Yeah, because as you've written in many of your books, even your articles, is that as Canada, contrary to that myth that Canada has always been a benevolent force for good in the world, and that they're the good version, they're the cool cousin or the good brother to America, the belligerent bully, but that's just not true because Canada, of course, was a partner in crime to the British Empire, now a partner in crime to, I would say, the Anglo-American British Empire, since Britain is still an imperial force in the world, right?
Yeah, for sure. Canada's been a uniquely close ally of the two main empires of the last 250 years. The British, very, very close, right at the center. Canadian elite have been, right at the center of the British Empire through the conquest of much of the African continent. You had Canadians who were governor generals or governors of British colonies in Kenya and northern Nigeria and Ghana. So you could be Canadian and you were just viewed as British, and you could lead that process. And then over the past 60, 70 years, as the U.S. empire has become the dominant force, Canada is, right close, and you can have a Canadian general. You can be a general of the Canadian military, and Canada can supposedly not have gone to war with Iraq in 2003, but you can be in charge of 35,000 troops as a Canadian general that's on loan to the U.S. military, right? Which is the case with the Canadian general in Iraq. So it's a pretty unique, uniquely close ties, again, to the two most destructive imperial forces over the past 250 years. And if you note in the petition, in a letter, it begins with that precise thing, this idea of the mythology of Canada and not being an actual, benevolent actor, right? It starts right off the bat with the mythology, which is that type of argument doesn't get into dominant media outlets very often, and so to be able to get that into the Toronto Star and to have that, we don't know exactly how many people have read the petition, but we know that more than 3,000 have signed it, dozens and dozens of groups. We know that tens, hundreds, probably other thousands more people have read it, and then tens and tens of thousands more have read bits of it that have appeared in different media outlets. So it's right off the bat. It's a challenging of that whole deeply held myth. I mean, it's done in a very soft kind of way, but nonetheless, it is there, which I think is quite important.
The gap between the perception and the reality, and when it comes to Canadian foreign policy, is pretty dangerous, in many ways. And so I'm really glad that we've been able to seize this opportunity. We'll see how much of an impact it has, but I think any impact that we can have is a positive thing. Even just a sense that there are eyes on Canadian foreign policy, and that there are question marks. Is a very good start in terms of just keeping an eye on what our country is actually doing, and beginning this really sort of critical discussion of Canadian foreign policy. And hopefully this is just the door is just going to be widened a little bit through the success of this campaign for that critical discussion going forwards.
And if they lose, right? If they lose the seat for the Security Council, then that door will open more in terms of having because it's going to be very hard for the media to not they're gonna this is going to be reported on widely. Right?
It's going to make the Canadian public at large have to actually really look at the fact that Canada has never ever been a force for good in the world, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think there'll definitely be a need to reckon with, our foreign policy, and hopefully there'll be a call for a fundamental reassessment of Canada's foreign policy.
Now, Bianca, you're from you are from Canada, but your family originates from Uganda, right?
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, my mom is from the Congo, Zaire, and Canada, of course, has had a destructive role in both countries. Can you remind people what Canada, what Canada, did diplomatically and a little bit behind the scenes when it came to Uganda? Because Yves told me, and of course I read the book Canada and Africa: 300 Years of Aid and Exploitation. Now, Daddy Trudeau, Pierre Trudeau, Justin Trudeau's father, he overthrew or gave diplomatic support in overthrowing Milton Obote and supporting the butcher of Uganda, right? Idi Amin, right?
Well, I mean, I actually think that Yves probably has more information on that because he's really sort of delved into it. But, in the most general sense, across the continent, through its sort of like aid, investment, accords, diplomacy, the Canadian government has definitely had a lot of harm across the continent. And I really noticed that with the short video that I put out talking about this, I really felt like there was a strong response, from people living in Uganda, East Africa, where it's resonant, people know this, I think more so than people living in Canada, because they felt the impacts of the foreign policy.
It was sent to the Foreign Affairs, we know it was sent to the Foreign Affairs Minister of Uganda as well, Bianca's video saying no to Canada on the Security Council because of Canadian policy in Africa.
Yeah.
But just to give you the precise on the Milton Obote. So I mean, Milton Obote was the post-independence leader in Uganda, and he was ousted by Idi Amin, who obviously is among there's not many most people don't know much about Uganda globally, or in Canada or North America, but often they've heard of Idi Amin. And Milton Obote was a sort of nationalist politician, particularly in his first government, and they Britain was tied into Idi Amin's coup against Obote. And when I took a look at the House of Commons records in Canada of around the period, both the Prime Minister, Pierre Trudeau, who was Justin Trudeau's father, of course, and the Foreign Affairs Minister, they both refused to they were asked about it, they refused to condemn the coup. And they provided sort of soft, and there's a Canadian aid worker on the ground that talked about how the Canadian Aid Agency was supportive of the coup in Idi Amin's coup. Now that's something, of course. Now Idi Amin is entirely demonized in the Western press, but the role that Britain and Canada very passively played in the coup, his coup, that gets kind of taken out of the discussion. But.
And Bianca, is Canada is Canada still supporting the very oppressive leader that currently holds position in Uganda? I think Youri Museveni, right?
I think the countries are allied. I don't know too much about the ins and outs of the diplomatic relationship, but I don't think that I don't get the sense that there's a strained relationship between the two countries.
Trudeau spoke with Museveni as part of the bid for the Security Council. He's trying to win. Just 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, he had a call with Museveni, partly trying to win Ugandan support for Canada's bid on the Security Council.
It does feel like Uganda is one of the countries that has been sort of targeted for an appeal around this United Nations Security Council bid.
And how much more time do you both have, actually?
I can go for a while longer. Bianca needs to get going.
I gotta get going. Thank you so much, Youri.
No problem. Well, Bianca, I hope to invite you back on the show 1+1 again, because there's more I would like to talk to you about, especially on the environmental front. And there was a question I wanted to ask you about the book and a lecture you made where you kind of slam TLC song "No Scrubs," but that'll be to be continued.
Good song. It's just the lyrics. All right. Thank you, Youri.
No problem. Thanks for joining us. Bianca. All right. Okay. In audio version, guys, Bianca has just left us, but we're still joined by our good friend Yves Engler. Now, Yves. Since with this campaign, now I assume you must have gotten some pushback from the Canadian saint and the greatest con artist of our time, Romeo Dallaire. What has been his commentary and influential commentary, if it has been influential?
Yeah, he hasn't pushed back specifically on our campaign. I know I saw a few months ago he's quoted in some stories about the Security Council bid. He's of course supportive. The vast majority of the political spectrum is supportive, right? Even former NDP leaders, they're supportive of Canada's bid for Security Council seat. There's almost no one, except for the people that have endorsed the petition that we organize. People like David Suzuki. There's almost no one in a sort of official political realm that has come out against Canada's bid. There's some criticism of Canadian policies, but they don't ever say, well, the substance of these policies leads to clearly Ireland and Norway are preferable options from any sort of progressive standpoint, preferable options. That has not been done because it's everyone's part of Team Canada, right? That's what's considered. We actually had the staffer of one of the left-wing MPs that we asked to sign one of the two petitions.
Was this Nikki Ashton or?
No, I'm not going to name the politician. It's not Nikki Ashton, but
okay, no problem.
But their staffer responded by literally saying, if we can't sign this because then we would be not perceived to not be part of Team Canada, and she actually used the word Team Canada, so there is this real nationalism that enters into the discussion, and Romeo Dallaire is one figure in that, but he hasn't been particularly involved in this issue.
So now we talked we talked at length last time about Canadian left nationalism and this mythology that much of the Canadian left, although you said it's starting to sort of wane, it's starting to sort of subside, this mythology that Canada is a colony. We were once a colony of of Britain. We're now a colony of America. America's forcing us to do this, and of course Quebec definitely has this. Well, you can say if it's bigger in Quebec, because of course Quebec, they think that they're a colony of first Britain and now modern day Canada. So how has it been when just in the off screen, when you're not doing web events, when you talk with Quebecers of the left who believe in Quebec being an independent country, but even also former waffle veterans and people who read Mel Hertzig, how has been the discussion trying to push back against the Canadian mythology that Canada is a colony of the United States, and therefore we actually can be a force for good in the world if we just get this Security Council seat, because it's not us that are doing it, it's America that's making us do it.
Yeah, I mean, there's many parts to that. Like, I think, first of all, with regards to the Security Council bid, people, sovereigntists in Quebec are much more comfortable saying they don't support Canada's bid for Security Council seats. So just one example, Ruba Gassal, who is the member of the Quebec legislature for the riding close to where I live here in Montreal, for Quebec Solidaire, which is the left-wing party. She actually did a video. She didn't just sign. She's of Palestinian descent, and she signed the open letter that says no to Canada's bid for Security Council seat due to its anti-Palestinian record. And then she actually did a video where she talked about, beyond just the Palestinian question, a number of issues. And in English Canada, it wouldn't be viable for a member of the Ontario legislature to do that. And so there's some the kind of anti-Canada thing makes that more acceptable, should I say, in among Quebec left-wing Quebec national circles. With regards to like English Canadian left nationalism, we definitely, this petition campaign ran up against that kind of ideology, and represented in it's a little bit difficult to know how much of it is running up against that ideology and how much of it is running up against sort of institutional economic kind of thing. So for instance, there's a number of sort of like the peace kind of groups and anti-disarmament groups that were unwilling to sign the petition.
Unwilling. Peace groups and disarmament groups unwilling to support your petition.
Unwilling to sign the petition, yeah. I mean, there's so many that did, but those are more like the sort of smaller kind of activist-y, not the NGO type peace disarmament groups. There's a whole group of them around mostly based in Ottawa, were unwilling to sign. And if you take a look at their kind of relationships, a lot of these people are, sometimes they're former Canadian diplomats involved in disarmament. So they were the left wing of the foreign affairs bureaucracy. Some of that goes on. Some of them get money from the government. So there's institutional connections like that. Then there tend to be charities. So they also, even if they don't get direct government grants, they're getting tax write-offs. So there's some of that. And then there's the ideology. right? So there's two components going. One of it is the actual connections and institutional connections, and then one is the sort of broader left nationalist ideology. It's not clear how much which one is shaping their inability to say no to Canada on the Security Council. Because again, it should be noted that obviously, if you're an organization that believes in nuclear disarmament, or you're campaigning these kind of things, or against the arms trade, again, this is not an endorsement of Norway or Ireland, but Canada is a more aggressive, more supportive of the whole nuclear proliferation, is a bigger international arms exporter, is more aggressive member of NATO than Ireland and Norway. So on the issues, it should be easy for any of these groups, individuals, to say, I support Norway and Ireland, because on the issues that I'm working on, Norway and Ireland are less bad than Canada. So then you say, well, why can't they do it? Why can't they sign it? And that's where you get to the question of the ideology and the nationalist ideology. So I don't know how much of this is about left nationalist ideology. It's clearly an important part, and how much of it is the actual direct connections to the government, and fearful of losing grants, or fearful of losing a charitable status, or stuff like that. One group actually stated explicitly that they couldn't sign because of one peace group or anti-arms trade group said they couldn't sign specifically because of the charity, their registered charity, and that could put them in difficulty again. And you don't even know, sometimes when people say that, maybe it's not just that's motivating it. They're concerned about the more they're ideologically committed to sort of left nationalist thinking. Yeah, so it's difficult to tell, but irrespective of all this kind of stuff, it's a very healthy exercise to go through this, and even to force groups to say no, right? To force to have these sort of discussions. And I also think that one of the things that's made happen, if Canada does lose the seat, we've already started seeing this as the campaign's gotten bigger. Some groups, for instance, one Palestinian Solidarity group that should in my opinion, is outrageous. They were unwilling to sign the open letter on the one specific on Palestine. They have now, because we started to cause some headway, they've now sort of basically not completely endorsed, but basically endorsed the campaign. So I'm hoping that if
do you think that's because that Palestinian group you mentioned? Do you think that's just because they just don't know that Canada has actually not been an honest broker?
No, it's not. They know full well. It's a combination of left nationalist ideology. It's a fear to be anti-nationalist, or and a sort of like they want to have a foot in Parliament Hill, right? They engage in lobbying, and they want to sort of be and this endorsing no to Canada on the Security Council would be viewed as marginalizing. But it won't be viewed as marginalizing if Canada actually loses, and right. So then they can see how this process, and we've already made the campaign less marginal, and so right. Because again, if you get into the concrete issues, if you support Palestinian rights, I mean, Canada has voted against 166 resolutions upholding Palestinian rights over the past 20 years. Ireland and Norway,
and this is not just Stephen Harper, who, as I've mentioned before, people kind of make him out as this outlier. This is
Trudeau is worse. Trudeau's government's been worse than the Stephen Harper government when it comes to UN resolutions. Now, Ireland and Norway have not voted against one of those resolutions over the past 20 years. They've voted in favor of one country's 249, other country's 251. Canada has voted against, right? So it's just like, the numbers don't lie. I mean, it's not up for discussion. Clearly, Canada's policy is worse on the issue. So if you're not able to say, well, I prefer Ireland and Norway, it's only because there's some sort of either ideological blocking, or some political world that you want to operate in, or some sort of financial incentive that you see that makes it difficult to come out explicitly against the Security Council bid. And so Palestine is the starkest example, because it's literally, we have the voting record of those countries on UN resolutions, and you can't argue this stuff. It's just the numbers. Some of the other areas is a little bit less clear, but nuclear disarmament, right? Ireland has signed the recent effort to ban nuclear weapons that came out of the 2017 convention. Canada hasn't, nor has Norway. Anyway, so you can find some pretty clear, or on Venezuela, right? Again, Ireland and Norway, as part of the EU, have gone along with this process of recognizing Juan Guaido, but that's a much that's a much softer than Canada's position, right? Canada's not only was the day of Juan Guaido was involved in the whole process of deciding to even go about recognizing Juan Guaido as president. Canada was involved in bringing together opposition groups within Venezuela to get behind that idea and to bring together external opposition, i.e. Colombia, US, and a few other South American countries. So Canada was involved in that, but also it's part of the Lima Group that goes back, a couple of years before the outside forces recognizing Juan Guaido, and was part of laying the whole groundwork for that to even be, a possible scenario. So, that again, that's not an endorsement of Norway's position on Venezuela or Ireland's position, but you can't even come close to comparing it to Canada's position. Or if you take Haiti, right, and the core group of countries that have been terrorizing Haiti in recent years, and at least since the 2004 coup. Both of those countries, as part of the European Union has at times, I'm not sure if it's always, but it has at times been part of the core group, i.e. the US, Canada, France, sometimes Brazil, sometimes the UN, sometimes Spain, that basically determine Haitian affairs. So those countries would have some role in that, but it's nothing in the vicinity of Canada's role in terms of just deep engagement at every different level of the process of undermining Haitian democracy, undermining Haitian sovereignty, etc.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, yeah. Thanks so much. Yeah, thanks so much for talking about that, because that was probably the one issue I had with Bianca's article and other articles as well, which you guys at the CFPI have done, comparing Norway and Ireland. I think the one thing though where Norway is very similar though to Canada is probably its treatment of its indigenous people, because Norway has the Sami people, it's their own indigenous people, which Norway treats very harshly. I think that's the one thing that you can clearly compare it to Canada, but which yeah, people should definitely take into consideration. But just on the broad international thing, what Canada does at home to its indigenous people and its own black people, it does it does that on steroids. In Bolivia, Brazil, Venezuela, and how have the so that aside, how have the indigenous groups been responding? Because I know you say that you've had a hard time trying to enlighten indigenous groups and figures on what Canada does outside of its borders.
Well, that's also an interesting question. I guess maybe should have been kind of raised alongside the Quebec sovereigntist movement and then left nationalism. If you look at the letter, there's some prominent indigenous leaders that have signed, people like Pam Palmater, Ellen
yeah. She's a great voice, voice.
Romeo Saganash. So the only NDP, and I'm just make sure this is correct, I believe this. So the only former NDP, Romeo Saganash was in the NDP caucus until the last election. So he didn't run again in October, but he signed. I think he's the only NDP, and I can say that a couple other former NDP MPs that are identified with the left of the party, who are not indigenous, were not comfortable with, were unwilling to sign, and were pursued. So I don't think it's a coincidence that it happens to be an indigenous former NDP MP who was willing to sign. And so, yeah, so I think there, Pamela Muller did a piece back with the sort of uprising with Wet'suwet'en solidarity uprising in the start of the year before that kind of got pushed aside by the pandemic. She wrote a piece, Canada doesn't deserve a seat on the Security Council back, I think it was in February, before that, our stuff was public and not focused on Canada's foreign policy, but focused on the continued dispossession of Indigenous people and racism and inequality. So yes, Indigenous obviously. While I have been, I think, on the previous interview we did, I was critical of an Indigenous leader for perpetuating the Canadian foreign policy mythology, and that is still an issue that is real. Where it's pretty amazing to see people who are fully cognizant and direct victims of the colonial apparatus, and not just historically, but ongoing, that they would then spout sort of nationalist mythology when it comes to international affairs. Having said that, clearly Indigenous leadership, First Nations people, and activists, etc., are much more comfortable than non-Indigenous people to be anti-Canada. I mean, that's obvious. So that's translated a bit into how the reaction to the campaign against Canada's seat on the Security Council.
Now, I'm pretty sure the Socialist Equality Party, which is a branch of the International Fourth Committee, one of the major Trotskyists, the true Trotskyist organization, which is definitely for revolutionary socialism and anti-imperialism across the board. Like you, they're very consistently anti-imperialist. They're not selectively anti-war. I'm pretty sure they support this. What about the Canadian Communist Party? And now, is the NDP, is it again this thing where the grassroots members are supporting no to Canada having a seat at the Security Council, whereas the leadership, the Jagmeet Singhs of the world, are all, definitely for Team Canada?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure if the Communist Party signed the petition. I know the Quebec Communist Party signed the petition after it was launched. I would be surprised if the Communist Party was against it. I don't remember if we reached out or not. I presume they would have. The people I know, I don't think would have had any problem. I think they did, but I'm not certain. With regards to the NDP, none of NDP officialdom has formally endorsed. After it was released on May 19th, the open letter, there was some people who had run for the NDP and some people, I think, were NDP MPs even, who tweeted out things that were kind of effectively an endorsement of it, but never formal kind of endorsement. The NDP, in my opinion, will have a pretty big self-interest if Canada loses the seat, to take some shots at Justin Trudeau, and it would be really because it will be a blow to Trudeau's brand. There's some element to this that I think that now the government, to a large extent, has gotten to just in a damage control mode. They're really nervous that if they lose this will be a blow to the sort of, everyone loves our prime minister around the world, and Canadians like to have that. I think most people do, but particularly I think Canadians like to have the sense that people around the world like us, and so that's part of Justin Trudeau's brand. And so losing the seat would go some way in hurting that brand. And so I think the NDP will have a big self-interest to take some shots at Trudeau's foreign policy and put the blame on the government for losing the seat, which they've mostly not done since they've taken some shots at, they criticized some elements of Canadian foreign policy in the context of the Security Council seat, but they've certainly never said we oppose Canada's bid. And then mostly the criticisms have been kind of around the edges. But I would presume they're going to take up, I hope, and I would presume they're going to take a more forthright position if they do lose. And then that, of course, will give some of the ideas that we've been putting forward. Hopefully, that will give a much bigger platform to some of those ideas. But no, so far the NDP has been quite reluctant to criticize on foreign policy in general, and specifically around the Security Council bid.
Now the one person who's running in a leadership bid for a party in Canada is past guest on this show, Dimitri Lascaris, who was on the second episode after I interviewed you, who's running for the leadership bid of the Green Party of Canada. He's one of the few. I think he is one of the few politicians of any of the. I think the Green Party is, safe to say, a bit of a major party where he actually does speak out against Canadian imperialism uncompromisingly. And I know that you endorse Dimitri for the leadership of the Green Party. So have you seen any web events of Green Party leaderships where you can compare the different people running in the Green Party's foreign policy positions compared to Dimitri, who also endorses Canada not having a seat at the Security Council?
I haven't paid close enough attention. I can say, one of the other front runners is Murner. I'm forgetting his first name right now, who ran for the Greens in the last election in just outside of Victoria on Vancouver Island. He was a former Liberal. He ran for the Liberal Party previously, right? He broke from
I think I'm familiar with him. He
broke. He seems to be the candidate of the sort of Elizabeth May and much of the sort of leadership of the Green Party. Of course, you know that Dimitri's candidacy for the Green Party leadership was rejected by the party, and then he had to appeal, and on appeal they let him run. So they actually rejected his candidacy, and then so that in and of itself tells you a little bit about how they, the party establishment's position to him. But I can't say that I know the foreign policy positions of the. I think it's now up to 10. There's 10 candidates that are formally in the running for the leadership. I don't know their positions, but I'm pretty confident that Dimitri's positions are better than others. And not just what your position is sort of at some point when you might want to try to get people to back you, but actually willing to take up the issues and to do it in a principled way, which Dimitri has clearly shown on multiple occasions. But yeah, like there is on with regards to the Security Council. See, neither of the Green Party MPs that are in the House of Commons, they were not, of course, willing to endorse the campaign, even though, again, just take a look at on the climate question, right? Canada's per capita greenhouse gas emissions, Ireland and Norway's are like 50% less than Canada's. So just at that really simple metric. So if you go to the Canadian government's website promoting its candidacy for the Security Council, it talks about the environment a whole bunch. It talks about climate change. It talks about how it will raise climate change and this kind of stuff. But, that might sort of sound whatever, but if your greenhouse gas emissions per capita are far worse than those countries that you're competing with for the seat on the Security Council, just even by your own standards, you're kind of like making the argument for Ireland and Norway of being better options. If you're saying, the climate question and the Security Council is really important, and then you're worse on that issue, it seems to me like you're that's not a strong argument for your candidacy. But again, even though those numbers are not up for dispute, there's a reluctance from Green Party politicians to endorse the No Canada Security Council, and I think again that gets back to questions of ideology, questions of short-sighted political, what's good for me, whatever, etc.
And also not making the connection that military, that you can't be an environmentalist, let alone an eco-socialist, and be supporting militarism overseas.
For sure, and we've seen that with Elizabeth May, the leader of the Green Party, who has, she did vote against, to give her credit, in one of the votes in the House of Commons, she voted against the bombing and the attack on Libya.
Yeah, that war for oil, yeah.
But she also is totally unwilling to oppose spending on 70 billion, or depending on how you calculate it, maybe as much as 100 billion on naval vessels for the Canadian Navy, and her stuff on fighter jets is sort of like, we're against F-35, but not necessarily against fighter jets, right? It's just that type of fighter jet is too militaristic. That other type of fighter jet is maybe okay.
Yeah, Bernie Sanders had also a very troublesome position on the F-35 fighter jets in his home state of Vermont, which he got. Yeah.
So those kind of questions come up, and you see that with how people react to different kind of campaigns. But yeah, the Green Party is, when it comes to foreign policy, Elizabeth May many times has shown herself to not be much different than the kind of the more like left or liberal end of the Ottawa swamp of foreign policy. There's all kinds of reasons why when an MP or even a leader of the party goes to Ottawa, operates in a milieu where, if you take a look at first of all the power of the foreign affairs bureaucracy, of the military lobbyists, of the different think tanks, of the different your colleagues in the House of Commons. So, Elizabeth May's done a whole bunch of stuff with Irwin Cotler. Irwin Cotler, of course, is a staunch anti-Palestinian former MP.
Well, actually, and very briefly, we're gonna have to talk about him another time. But Irwin Cotler, for people who are completely alien to Canadian politics, the best way to describe him is basically the Canadian Alan Dershowitz.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. So like a Canadian Alan Dershowitz. So, anyways, Elizabeth May's done a whole bunch of things with Irwin Cotler on Iran, and I think even on like it's all framed under like political prisoners, right? But it's all part of the sort of imperial kind of demonization, so there's all kinds of reasons for why. Even somebody who really is of the best intentions, if you say, for an MP, when they get to Ottawa and there's all these kind of constraints, media constraints, whatever, that push you in a certain direction, and generally they push you away from challenging Canadian foreign policy in any sort of really meaningful kind of way. That's the dynamic within the Green Party. If Dimitri was to win the leadership of the party, he would still face many of the similar kind of pressures in terms of, okay, let's make this less of an issue, let's prioritize other issues. And quite frankly, I presume that's the case already, right? Like when you're involved in this campaign, you got to prioritize the issues that are you view as more likely to get support, and so yeah. Anyways, that's those dynamics are faced by the Green Party leadership, and those are it's a broader political culture. That's to me what I'm trying to do in this process, but be it from writing books or engaging in the campaign around the No to Canada Security Council, it's to break with this political culture that constrains these discussions, and allow for a little bit more kind of critical discussion of Canadian foreign policy.
And one last question about Dimitri is. Dimitri mentioned to me that actually the Green Party race has actually gotten very little attention in not just the Canadian corporate media, which that's a given, but even the Canadian left-leaning media. Is that true?
That's my impression. Yeah, I mean, I think that part of it is just explained by the pandemic and sort of, you know, it's all taking place online at this point, and even the race in the Conservative Party for the leadership of the Conservative Party has gotten just very limited. I mean, it did prior to the pandemic. It was covered a fair bit, so I think that would be a contributing factor. And for the Green Party is there's some interesting dynamics on that, right? Where a part of the left, the dominant kind of left institutions in this country, they're very aligned with the NDP, of course. So
Dimitri thinks that's why probably Canadian left-wing indie press hasn't been covering it that much.
So it puts a, you know, kind of, it's a certain element of pressure against making the Green Party an important affair. And, you know, you can just like concrete examples aside from, you know, sort of faunding, like Rabble.ca. The head of Rabble.ca is the partner of Libby Davies, who's a longstanding NDP MP. So there's all kind. You know, the Rabble is it's I wouldn't say it's just like an NDP outlet. It clearly sometimes they're willing to criticize the NDP and whatnot, but there's, you know, clear links between Rabble and sort of the more left end of the NDP. So that of course has an effect on how much importance they want to give to a Green Party leadership race.
And actually shifting a little bit, because I know you're never afraid to confront the Canadian left. So, one question I wanted to ask you was, you wrote a very good article actually defending the documentary Planet of the Humans, which first I was judging the book by its cover, going, it's produced by Michael Moore, and Michael Moore, he threw Ralph Nader under the bus. He always supports lesser evilism, whether it's Obama and the Clintons. So I, first, just absolutely completely rejected wanting to watch the documentary. But then I read your article defending the documentary and actually criticizing, 350.org's Bill McKibben and the the sort of respectable green left. Do you want to talk a bit about about the documentary and the problems of the the 350.org and all of those guys?
Well, what I think is that the reaction to the documentary, that's mostly what I was responding to. The reaction to the documentary is more enlightening than the documentary itself. And basically, there was a panic, a really quite impressive panic tantrum, if you like to use that word, from the the broad NGO green liberal media. So almost all of the dominant environmental organizations felt the need to condemn the documentary. Many of the most prominent figures in that world, and then media outlets like The Guardian and whatnot. They claim, we actually sort of look into what their claims against the documentary. One of the most common ones was that it was, the information was outdated, right? Well, every book or film that has ever been produced, by the point it's being watched, the information is outdated by definition, right? Like, so, okay, maybe you're saying it was a bit more outdated than normal, but basically how I saw it, what the reaction to Planet of the Humans was that two things. One is that the film is hostile to sort of green capitalist technological fixes, and it's makes it clear, which I don't believe is at all up for discussion, really, that we need to consume less. There needs to be, and I don't want to say we need to consume less. I mean, society needs to consume less. Humanity, Canada, the U.S., though that I don't see it in the individual sense of I just need to be less of a consumer. I say it in a we need to collectively have less of a consumptive economy, society, politics, etc.
Do away with the profit system.
Yeah, well, and I think you can't consume less. We have an economic system that is structured around endless consumption. Capitalism does not accept not growing and more and more and more. You can argue theoretically in some abstract way that we could figure out a way of every source of energy and everything was recyclable in a way that theoretically you could kind of meld this endless growth with sustainability. In anything approaching practicality, that it's just literally there's a carrying capacity of the earth that we just keep every year surpassing the carrying capacity and getting the gaps getting bigger and bigger and bigger over the past 50 years. And it leads to all kinds of, from species destruction to, ecosystems being destroyed to obviously the climate crisis and on and on and on. And so the environmental world has basically aligned itself with a green capitalist world that is not as big as the fossil fuel companies, particularly the oil companies, because the coal companies, although they're still powerful, are somewhat on a downward slope. The green capitalists, and be that I say green capitalists in quotations, be that wind farms or solar or ethanol, and according to some people's description, and many others, or the electric car, according to some people, that's part of the green capitalist world. So basically, the environmental groups have basically aligned with that sector of capital against this other sector of capital, the fossil fuel world. And yeah, if I would prefer certainly. I mean, wind farms and solar. That's the best end of the green capitalist world. But you prefer that, of course, to coal and oil. But there are many problems, right? We start delving into how many minerals need to be extracted for wind turbines and solar panels. So there's some real questions like that, and basically you can't get around the fact that we need to consume less. Now there is no body of capital behind the idea of we need to consume less, right? There's not some big industry that hopes to, unlike the green capitalist industry, where worth hundreds of billions. There's no industry saying, "Hey, yes, we think that's a good idea to consume less. We're going to make more money from that," because they're not going to make money. It's precisely not what's going to happen. So I think that the panic, and alongside that in the film, they point out that the green organizations, this is not, again, it's not at all controversial, that they have all kinds of ties to rich people, sometimes directly to corporations, to foundations that were set up by rich people who
Rockefeller, Ford Foundations, the Landon Foundations, Open Societies,
on and on and on. And so, and on top of that, beyond those questions, they are operating in a political media climate that, again, is dominated by corporate media, by corporations who are the main advertisers for that media. So to believe that a combination of their direct financial ties, they're operating within a media sphere, to believe that that's not impacting these green groups' positions would be insane. Clearly, it's impacting their positions, and it's driving them towards putting forward positions that are amenable or more acceptable to a sector of green capitalism, whatever. And I think that's the essence to me of the film. And basically, there's a panic about pointing this out, not because it's not true, not because hasn't been pointed out many other places, but because it's been pointed out by somebody with a bit of power on the left, i.e. Michael Moore, who's got a well-known name, got a capacity to produce a full documentary-length film that's of fairly high kind of standards. And so the panic is not, again, not that this information is the first time that Bill McKibben has heard these criticisms. Bill McKibben has heard these criticisms of his policies, for a long time, but all of a sudden now it's large numbers of people that are hearing these criticisms, and hence the panic, the attacks against the film. And they ultimately tried to, shut it down. They actually got it pulled off of YouTube. They've actually been, successful in that. Alongside that, is it another thing I haven't been following. When doing the Stop Signs, Cars and Capitalism book.
Yeah, this
10 years ago.
Book. Yeah.
Right, looked into. I followed a lot of this stuff in the environmental world pretty closely. I haven't followed that stuff as closely in recent years. But like Bill McKibben is like an explicit endorser of the American military as a force to fight climate change. Right, I was taken aback by that. He has a piece in about a year ago in the New York Review of Books that explicitly responds to people who bring up the fact that the Pentagon is the number one greenhouse gas emitter, institutional greenhouse gas emitter in the world, which he admits in this article, but then he kind of dismisses it. Well, it's only the size of all of the greenhouse gas emissions of Denmark. He sort of dismisses the importance, right? Which is incredible. It's the exact same argument that people arguing for the tar sands make. Well, all of the tar sands, it's only equivalent to one country that we would eliminate their greenhouse gas emissions. So, anyways, this article is quite fascinating how he endorses the military, so clearly Bill McKibben is someone. Again, he's the best end of the dominant environmental groups. So I like a lot of the stuff that Bill McKibben, a lot of the work he's done. But clearly he is somebody who has either prioritized making his positions acceptable within kind of the left end of the mainstream, or he's somebody who just genuinely believes that. But it's important for people to, I think in a respectful manner, to point out when these leaders are conceding too much to the dominant order.
Yeah, I mean, Naomi Klein, I just want to comment quickly. Naomi Klein, who is somebody I really do like. I really do. I love her books. I have Shock Doctrine. This Changes Everything. In This Changes Everything, she goes after the fact that the fossil fuel companies have been donating to the big green groups, hence this whole green capitalism. But I was always, puzzled why Naomi Klein never talked about the meat industry. And every time, and this is when Cowspiracy also came out, and every time protesters who would protest in a very Gandhian way or would just ask her, hey, Naomi and Avi, what about the meat industry? The response was always that they would either just ignore it completely or have these very kind of puzzled responses, as you mentioned, as Bill McKibben would do these kind of tar sands type of things. And then of course, Naomi Klein, while she focuses on climate change, she doesn't talk about she doesn't talk that much about imperialism anymore. I think that's probably because she has a gig at The Intercept, and Piero Midyar is this repugnant oligarch, this arch neoliberal who who really wants to see Syria destroyed, isn't too keen on socialist governments in Venezuela and so forth. And then you even had Extinction Rebellion supporting the coup against Evo Morales in Bolivia, and weaponizing Morales's sort of oil-friendly policies as a means of justifying his removal, even though the people who removed him were a bunch of mining-backed oil fossil fuels, a right-wing oligarch, and explicitly racist one.
I wasn't aware that Extinction Rebellion had endorsed the coup in Bolivia. It's clearly, from an ecological standpoint, it's not been a step forward for for ecological issues. But yeah, I mean, there is I think concessions to imperialism that take place throughout, if to try to move up in different kind of media spheres, downplaying or stopping criticisms of U.S. or Canadian foreign policy seems to be a common thing that people do in terms of that process. Naomi Klein attacked the film Planet of the Humans. She very much came to Bill McKibben's defense in a very aggressive way, which I think is she's going to look back on that realize that was kind of exposing how much she sort of got into bed with the sort of major green NGOs that she claims to be critical of. And again, 350.org is not the same thing as the World Wildlife Fund or whatever, right? 350.org has clearly done some important work in stimulating, and Bill McKibben specifically stimulating climate activism. But at the same time, there are some real questions about the policies of certainly of McKibben and 350.org that Planet of the Humans raises, and I don't believe it raises in any way that's incorrect. I don't think it's wrong for someone at a film producer to go to a rally and ask Bill McKibben's opinion on biomass, and which they did, and then some people frame it as some sort of like attack against Bill McKibben, and I feel like the way it was done, it seems like a totally acceptable political form. But
at least because now David Suzuki is still part of the LEAP organization, which Bianca used to be a part before she joined the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, right?
No, David Suzuki was never a member of. He endorsed the LEAP manifesto when it was launched 5 years ago, but he's just I think a supporter on the outside.
Now, how important is it for somebody like him, who was basically the Canadian Sir David Attenborough, although not afraid to really clash with the Canadian establishment when push comes to shove? How important is it his endorsement of Canada, no Canada having a seat at the UN Security Council?
It was very important. It was probably the most important endorsement, and it was a little bit surprising. We wasn't necessarily just expected. He has clearly gone more to the left, as he is. I mean, he states this himself. He was on CBC as like a nature journalist for decades and decades, and became very prominent as a I wouldn't say like apolitical, but didn't on the surface of it didn't seem that political, sort of kind of nature focused documentaries and shows, but as he's sort of he's very old now, and as he's sort of been, I think, kind of like radicalized by the state of the ecological crisis, and is more and more prepared to talk about anti-capitalism, and to in this case to go explicitly against Canadian nationalist sort of mythology around international affairs.
And of course he was a survivor of Canadian institutional racism. He's a survivor of the Canadian Japanese internment camps, right?
Yes, yeah, he was. I don't know exactly how old, but like a young kid when thousands and thousands of people of Japanese descent in British Columbia were interned during World War II. and were, serious, flagrant form of Canadian racism.
Now, Yves, how many more questions can I squeeze out?
I actually should get going pretty quickly. So.
Well, Yves, you're always very generous with your time. So, okay. So I think the last question I want to ask you. We're going to do this next time I get the chance to talk to you. I actually want to focus specifically about Quebec and Quebec politics, and because you've written about Quebec's victimhood and the bigotry that comes with Quebec nationalism. So I'm gonna have to save that for another time, because but I did want to ask you about cars and so forth. And have the environmental groups still not confronted the car industry as they should? Because you and Bianca's book, which we're going to have to get her back on another time also to talk about it. This was quite a tour de force, and it's made me not feel guilty about not knowing how to drive. Can you talk briefly about if the Greens, if the Green and the eco movements have failed in their in confronting the car industry?
Well, that's where, like, the Planet of the Humans debate and all that, watching all that, that's where I have a great sympathy for those who are sort of critical of the main environmental organizations, because I saw the process around the private automobile. I followed it very closely in a couple of years before writing the book, and in the time after the book, I followed it a little bit less closely in recent years. But basically, my opinion is that we can. Well, first of all, we need to move away from the private automobile. It is not. There's no possibility where most of the 7.8 billion people on the planet can get around by private automobile. That is not going to be sustainable. Even if those are all electric cars, just the amount of minerals, still the energy that would be required, the production phase, the destruction phase. It's not just the actual oil that goes into the driving, each extra kilometer, but it's the whole package. And I should say the package is not just the actual automobile either. It's also how, urban sprawl and people living in massive houses that have, 6 couches and have multi appliances. The car also underpins. There is no Walmart without the private automobile, right? And I can get into all the explanations for that, but it's in the book. So the private automobile underpins a whole model of living and of capitalism, of development that is clearly unsustainable. On top of that, it's not very good for our health directly, in the sense that we need to get exercise, and it undercuts that, and not from the standpoint of the pollutants that are released. Cars release all kinds of pollutants that are bad for our health. I also believe it doesn't lead to very pleasant places to live. Personally, I feel like people don't go like, hey, I want to travel to Houston suburbs. Right? They say, hey, I want to go to Venice, which is a car-free city, right? The places that people want to travel to tend to be places actually quite limited cars.
Has the car isolated more people then? Because I think you made that point, that actually isolates people more, right?
From the standpoint of the left, the correlation is quite strong between car-dependent areas, just a simple one, car-dependent areas almost always vote more right wing. You can't have demonstrations are very difficult to pull off in the suburbs and in the exurbs and whatever. So from the standpoint of just literally building the left and left politics, cities and places where it's easy to access people by leaflets, by posters, where taking the physical space by demonstrations. All that so from the standpoint just from left politics, the car dominance of private automobile is a bad thing. So you put all these pieces together and you say, well, obviously we would prefer, and then you talk about cost. Okay, well, like we know in the here and now that there are cities, like if you compare Amsterdam's, the amount of money spent on transport in Amsterdam versus Houston, the GDP per capita that goes into transport in Amsterdam would be less than half of Houston, right? Or Japan versus the U.S. is how much money spent on transport. The U.S. is like twice as high as Japan. That's in large part because there's less of a reliance on the private automobile. The private automobile is very expensive, right? So you can move, if you move away from the private automobile, you can actually you're saving money, right? Now, capitalism, of course, isn't. Capitalism wants endless consumption and more growth, and it's precisely the inefficiency of the private automobile that is what is good for capitalism, because it generates so much economic spin-off. But anyways, getting back to environmental organizations, they largely ignore the private automobile, despite, again, for so many different reasons. It would be a good focal point, because it is not a politically easy thing to take on. It's not a politically easy thing to take on for a whole series of reasons. For the fact that most media, car companies have been traditionally the biggest advertisers, right? And there's all kinds of examples of car companies withdrawing their ads from newspapers when newspapers wrote things critical of the automobile industry. It's obviously a huge source of just profit and capital that is you're taking on a lot of power. There's also that so many of us are now we're stuck by the urban planning that we've created. We created urban planning that makes it very difficult to get from A to B without a private automobile. So people feel personally, stuck by their situation. So basically, the main environmental organizations have avoided taking on the private automobile, the auto industrial complex. And I think the explanation is not because it shouldn't be taken on for ecological reasons, for health reasons, for urban planning reasons, but more because it's a political fight they don't want to take on, and that has to do with their donors. It has to do with how they want to operate in the dominant media.
Who have conned them into saying that the car is a necessary evil, although that necessary evil is still going to destroy existence as we know it, right?
Exactly. Again, go back to the first point. You can't 7.8 the humanity having private automobile use, anything equivalent. Obviously, the U.S. is at the far outlier. Anything equivalent to Canada or even much of Western Europe, that is not. There's no scenario where that's sustainable, right? And that is what I mean. If North Americans are going to say that we all need to have, everybody over the age of 16 needs to have a private automobile, well, why can't Indians say the same thing? Why can't Congolese say the same thing? So if you're not seeing this from that big picture, let alone it's already unsustainable, just even the numbers in North America, but that humanity as a whole going in that direction is so we have to figure out something else. But the environmental organizations have largely ignored taking on that fight.
And yeah, final question is, are we able to have say we stopped automobiles tomorrow, which is good because that means no extracting fossil fuels. But what about a whole public transportation revolution where we all travel by trains and trams? Isn't that still going to be bad for the environment?
It's less damaging. I mean, I agree that there's a whole debate. I mean, we're so far away from that debate because we're in a situation where the private automobile is so dominant. But there's a whole debate of is a train-oriented urban sphere an ideal urban sphere, or is something more like a walking and biking oriented urban sphere really the urban sphere that we want, right? I personally, I mean, there's clearly a role for trains. I see a role for trains in any, and we're talking about long way down the future kind of planning. But I would argue that you want to have a situation where most people can get most of what they need or want on a day-to-day basis by foot, by bike, and then some people, if the outer fringes of a city, there maybe they have a metro that takes them to the core of the city. And if you look at it, this is not just sort of like pie in the sky. I mean, if you look at Copenhagen or Amsterdam, it's something like a third of the population that commutes to work every day by bike, right?
But they would argue it's a smaller country and the places are much smaller, therefore we can do it, but not Canada or Australia and New Zealand and elsewhere.
Well, I mean, I'm just talking about a city per se, right? Like Copenhagen or Amsterdam is pretty, it's a question of urban planning. It's not a question of. I'm not arguing that there's not. Canada has distances between cities that make a lot of sense to, as damaging as flying is. It's not very practical to go from Vancouver to Montreal by train, right? It's it just so far, it takes so long. Obviously, people should be doing it less, right? And certainly until there's any sort of flying that's less greenhouse gas emitting. But within the city itself, I mean, there's no reason why Montreal couldn't have been and couldn't be structured more similar to Copenhagen than it is to Dallas. And if you even take Montreal, parts of it were structured. I mean, it's the earlier parts were structured more based upon walking and shorter distances, and increasingly the exurbs are structured like where you literally can't live there unless you have an automobile, and everyone who is under the age of 16 is literally chained to their parents until they can get their license so they can have the freedom to go around. So those are urban planning, economic, political decisions. They're not based upon particularly based upon the geography of the country.
Well, let's hope that Dimitri Lascaris becomes leader of the Green Party and that the Socialist Equality Party replaces the NDP as the real opposition. Hopefully we'll have a revolutionary public transportation system, amongst other things. On that note, Yves, I know you have to go, so thank you very much, and thank you also to Bianca for joining us. We need to get the two of you back on again just to do an update on the campaign. Canada, again, no seat for Canada in the UN Security Council. We'll be in touch about how that campaign goes. And, of course, we need to talk more about that. Make sure to give my best to her, and I hope that all goes well in that campaign. And the next time we have you back for a one-on-one interview, we need to do a special Quebec edition, all about Quebec.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thanks, Yves. Really appreciate it.
Thanks.